Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first meeting of 2013 of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Could I remind members to turn off mobile phones and Blackberries and so on, please? We have apologies from John Lamont, who's unable to attend our meeting today, and our Vice-Convener, Helen Eadie, has been delayed in the traffic from Fife. I think there's been a road accident and she's been delayed, so hopefully she'll be able to join us fairly soon. If we could move straight to agenda item 1. The first item in today's agenda is for members to agree to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is to allow members to discuss a procedure for considering complaints about cross-party groups. And item 4 relates to a possible amendment to a recently published cross-party group report. Are members content to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private? Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. If we can now move on to agenda item 2. Now, this item is to do with the Scottish Law Commission reports. We're taking evidence on the Law Reform Working Group's report on implementing the Scottish Law Commission reports. We've been joined today by Christine Graham, MSP, convener of the Justice Committee, Nigel Dawn, MSP, convener of the Subordinate Legislation Committee, Irene Fleming, Clerk to the Justice Committee, and Ewan Donald, Clerk to the Subordinate Legislation Committee. So I would welcome you all here this morning to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Now I think we'll just go straight into the discussion in relation to the report, which I know that you've seen. And the first thing I think I would like to ask, so we can get things moving, is that do you feel that the officials working group will be helpful in improving the rate at which the Law Commission reports are implemented? Do you, just as a general point, do you feel we're moving in the right direction here? Who wants to start? Ladies first.
Good morning, and this is very frightening to be on this side of the fence for a change, actually, in happy circumstances. Sometimes I've been before standards and it wasn't been so happy. Anyway, that said, I think it's obvious that we're mainly looking at the Justice Committee here, although the Law Commission reports are a spectrum across other committees. And there's no doubt that the Justice Committee just doesn't have the capacity, as has been throughout the many sessions of this Parliament. I was even, if I may just say as a slight preamble to this, is that what we're not looking at, I'll just put it on record, is a split into Justice 1 and Justice 2 committee. Been there, seen it, done it, got the T-shirt, was dreadful, fought it, lost, and then we got rid of it, thankfully. So we're not looking at that. It's a very narrow thing on Law Commission reports, and bills are practically off the shelf, if I may put it that way. So that, I can't argue against that. The Justice Committee hasn't got time to even do very many inquiries, and this was the case when Bill Aitken, my predecessor, chaired it. So, in principle, yes, subject to, and if you want me to, that's my general response to it, I'll leave it till we discuss the criteria.
Okay, fine, yeah. Nigel, do you wish to comment?
Yes, if I might add to that, Convener, and I note in the context that you and I were on the last Justice Committee, and we will recall the regularity with which meetings went past 1 o'clock, and simply, therefore, I think we can impress upon others the fact that the Justice Committee historically has a very full agenda. We also need to recognise that most of the Scottish Law Commission's short reports are justice issues. And so I hope that the simple answer to the question is yes, this provides a mechanism at the margins to help the implementation of some of the ones that would be relatively easier to do, but which may simply drop off the Justice Committee's agenda for simple pressure of time.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Now, there are a number of details in the report I think we would like to sort of tease out, and I know the members are interested in picking up on some of these. So if I could maybe ask Fiona MacLeod to come in at this stage.
Thank you, Convener. Interesting to hear your opening remarks. Thank you very much. So given that we are talking about these bills not going to the Justice Committee, can I ask you what you think of the 5 criteria suggested in paragraph 17 of the report, and whether you think they'll be suitable for ensuring that the bills go to subordinate legislation for consideration?
Be correct the member, it's not these bills, it's some of these bills may. I think that's very important, because when you look at the criteria, and I commend the working group in trying to come up with some kind of formula, even within that, though broadly in principle I agree with that, we have to look at it very carefully. We've all been where, let's take criteria A, wide degree of consensus among key stakeholders. Sometimes you think that's the case. You start taking evidence at stage one, it all falls apart. You find that wasn't the case whatsoever. So it has to be a very rigorous examination of that. It does not relate directly to criminal law reform. Again, you can start doing something and find there was an unintended direction something was going in. Same with significant financial implications. How often have we sat in committees and found out, oops, this is unforeseen, there's going to be costs in here. ECHR is the same, and so on. However, given that it's the Law Commission who will have, done a very sort of robust consultation, will have a report, I would hope that it would be a bill that's produced as laid. We've got a pretty clear direction, pretty clear indication. I'm not saying the government doesn't consult robustly, perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but anyway, I've said it. That we can have a clearer indication that perhaps there aren't any sort of things lurking in the woodpile that we didn't know about, things under stones that are going to turn up. So basically, yes, but that again is subject to something I'm going to perhaps move on to with a subsequent question. So basically, green principle.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, it seems to me that the 5 criteria there cover the 5 areas which need to be covered. So, in principle, I think I'm absolutely comfortable with what's there. Reading them, none of them is strict, other than the last one that the Scottish Government's not planning wider work. I mean, that's simply a fact. It either is or it isn't planning wider work. Where there is a wide degree of consensus is open to interpretation. Where it does not relate directly to criminal law reform is, I would suggest, certainly also open to to interpretation. But that, yes. With significant financial implications and significant ECHR, of course, somebody's going to have to decide what's significant. I think, therefore, what concerns me about these is that there needs to be a sensible interpretation of those words. And if there's one thing that I would want you perhaps to consider for your own reflection is whether the right kind of words are actually in there, or whether we could find better words. Because I wouldn't want all the work that's gone into this to finish up in a position where those who are interpreting the criteria never find a bill we can do. Because I think that would obviously be counterproductive. It's not the intention. So I think we just need to be careful that those are interpreted in a way that makes sense. Having said that, it might be that there isn't a bill which we can do. I think there are some of the relatively smaller ones. I think there will be, and that's the hope. But we need to be careful that we don't interpret the criteria in such a way that nothing ever gets through that particular sieve.
Is your concern that the 5 conditions there are maybe just too restrictive? Is that the worry that you have?
I think there's a risk that they might be interpreted in that way.
Yeah,
Now, maybe they're not, and maybe at the end of the day there will never be a Scottish Law Commission bill that meets them. And maybe, therefore, we're setting up a process, or we're trying to potentially setting up a process that is never going to be used because it just doesn't fit. But I'm concerned that it made sure if it doesn't fit, it's because there really isn't a bill that we can deal with, rather than because we've written the criteria wrongly. But having said that, can I also say the discussion with my committee about this earlier in the week, members were extremely concerned that we don't get criteria creep, because they share the view that Christine Graham's already expressed, that we don't want to become a Justice 2 committee, or indeed an anybody else's 2 committee. That's not our purpose. I don't think that's the objective of this. We're not, I think, to be the committee who picks up the legislation other people can't find time for. So I think we do have to understand these criteria need to be fairly strict. So we're only dealing with the things which are essentially not policy issues, which I think is how you reduce it to one line. It
would worry me a wee bit if we are creating a procedure which you've suggested may not actually bring anything to you. That would be a pretty pointless exercise. So you're right, I think. We've got to get this right, and it's got to be realistic. But it may well be that we'll not know until it's implemented just how it's going to work. So there might be a difficulty there. Did you want to come in?
Could I pursue that very question, Convener? Because I think that's actually one of the issues. I think there was a discussion in the previous session, actually, when this was discussed in the Justice Committee, that maybe we should try doing something like this on a pilot basis without changing standing orders much. What I would like to suggest to you is that whether the word pilot appears in anything before us at this stage, and assuming this is passed and something happens, I think it's almost inevitably the case that the very first one we do will be a substantial learning lesson and a pretty steep learning curve. And once, as we work through it, never mind afterwards, we'll then be able to rethink how we've done it and whether things need to be revisited.
I don't think I've got a problem with a pilot bill, as it were, going forward, because that would allow us to monitor whether or not we've got the criteria right. But that would be subject to what I want to come to, which is option 2 on your paper. And that's where I would submit that the Bureau should go to the subject committee first to see whether the conditions are met before referring the bill to if that's the most appropriate referral mechanism. Now then the committee would have before it the Commission's report, the bill is laid, the government's views, and the committee then could consider whether it itself saw any issues arising. Now there might be none, they might say this is a technical issue. We could report to the Bureau and say we've had a look at this, the Justice Committee hasn't got any reservations. There might be a middle line where the Justice Committee says we can't see any major things, however we're concerned that this may arise, or it might be a complete no, this is not a good idea, we can see issues here where this is a substantive bill and should come to the Justice Committee. It would then, the process would then be for the Bureau to make up its mind in the light of what the Justice Committee or any other subject committee say that's a Law Commission bill has had to say in the matter, and we would have to live with it. That said, however, what I would hope would then happen is if at any time during the process, let's say the bill's been referred, with or without any qualifications, with or without, or with some minor comments or even major comments, but it's gone anyway to the Subordinate Legislation Committee, I would submit that in those circumstances, if something arises that gives either the Sub-Legislative Committee concern or the Justice Committee concern, there should be a process in place whereby, I don't know what in court you would assist proceedings, but you know, where you halt this and refer back to the Bureau, let them reconsider whether or not this should be re-referred back to the subject committee. But I would hope that either of the committees, not just Sub-Legislative Committee, but the Justice Committee could also make a comment. Now, this is belt and braces stuff. You know, we're common sense, the convener, the two conveners here, all conveners in the Parliament are full of common sense. So that's would you, I hope. So what I'm saying is it'd be a common sense thing, but in order that we know where we're going, the framework would be that if either committee has these issues, then it would be sensible to stop things at that stage. So process to subject committee considers, makes some kind of comment or otherwise back to the Bureau refers. At any point where there's any issues arising, either committee can then say, stop the process. We think there's issues here that we need to reconsider.
You want to come in on this?
Yeah. One of the colleagues, Christine, you've actually touched on the point I was going to ask, and if you read the report is not going along the lines that you want it to. The report actually is suggesting that it will be the Bureau who will allocate or the bill. If I refer you to the report, it basically says that consideration by the Parliamentary Bureau as to whether the bill should be scrutinised by the Subordinate Leg Committee is option 1, and that's what's being recommended. So, in all essence, you won't even see or even get to touch the bill. It will be automatically referred to the Sub-Leg Committee, and you won't even be asked. So how do you feel about that?
Well, that's why I think, and if I recall, the committee actually took that view as well. It's not a good idea. I mean, the Bureau is fine. I mean, we have nothing to say if a bill was referred to us under my proposal of option 2, your option 2. We may have nothing to say. We say this is fine. You know, absolutely, the Bureau is fine. Just refer it to subordinate legislation. But the expertise that's built into the Justice Committee over a period of time, as is the expertise built in subordinate legislation and indeed this committee, is a very important balance in this Parliament. And that's where we would be able to say, well, from our experience, we can see some issues arising here, or not, as the case may be. So I think this is very helpful to the Bureau, helpful to the Subordinate Legislation Committee, who won't find themselves, if the Bureau made a mistake, with a bill referred to them, they've got to stop. It would look messy if you had to stop a bill in the middle of stage 1 because something had arisen that we could have told them in the first place.
So it would be your intention that anything would first of all come to your committee, and then your committee would decide, or yourself in conjunction with either the Bureau and the clerk? No?
No. No.
Your committee would decide to pass any relevant bills to the sub-ledge committee?
Decides the wrong word. Decides the wrong word.
Recommend.
We would give our observations.
Right.
I don't even know if you would call it recommend. We would give our observations on issues that we might see arising or not, as the case may be, in the bill that the Bureau wanted to refer directly to the Subordinate Legislation Committee. And it'd have to be a bill just relating to our committee, of course. And that would be it, our observations, like a wee report going to them. The decisions for the Bureau always is. And that would be the same if, let's say, it was passed to the Subordinate Legislation Committee, and the Subordinate Legislation Committee and the Justice Committee felt that something had arisen unforeseen that made it a bit difficult for subordinate legislation to do it within its remit. Again, all the two committees could do is refer a report back to the Bureau, and the Bureau could decide to leave it with subordinate. The Bureau is the powerful committee here. It always makes decisions about where bills will go.
So do you prefer option 2? Could I ask Nigel Dawn what option, if any, he would agree with?
Well, our committee observed that option 1 really is the reality, so we were quite comfortable with option 1, which recognises that the Bureau does make those decisions. At a personal level, can I say I understand Christine Graham's reflection that it might be sensible if the subject committee had prior sight of what was being suggested and might have some comments to make. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that the Bureau would probably recognise that beforehand and work in the informal way in which most things are done in this place, actually, and make sure that it took those soundings before it then decided to allocate a bill to us or anywhere else. And can I just remind folk that the Bureau has in the time done some strange things, even in my time. In the last session, the arbitration bill, which we turned into the Arbitration Act, manifestly a justice bill, came to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee simply because Justice did not have time to deal with it. I sat on both committees, so I saw it from both ends. And it worked fine. I imagine there were some private discussions beforehand with Bill Aitken, the Justice Committee's convener, about how he thought about that. But at the end of the day, the Bureau made that recommendation and Parliament, as always, passed it. So I think option 1 is de facto what happens. But I do think we do need just to register that a subject committee, I think a subject committee should be consulted before something within its bailiwick is given away.
I think the difference maybe is you're suggesting that consultation would happen in practice anyway, you know. But Christine, do you want to come back?
Well, I don't like it not going to the committee. I think the committee is collegiate. It works very well together, the Justice Committee. I would not want to make decisions or to make representations on behalf of myself as a convener, rather than have the committee behind me. And also the input that can come in from the committee. I mean, we've got on the Justice Committee, I think, I'm trying to count, is it 3 with law degrees, or 4 of us and 2 ex-police and ex-counsel. We've got a good range, a substantive range of people who can see issues within legislation from their different experience in their previous professions as well as politicians. So I would want the committee to be able to say, because you might, I mean, I don't think this is going to happen very often, but I don't think that if you were to just have the Bureau saying this bill goes to subordinate legislation because we say this is non-contentious and it fits this criteria, I don't think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate the committee does. And if I may return to quirky decisions that the Bureau has made, let's take the end of life assistance bill. which really either was a justice issue on capacity or a health issue. But they created a whole new committee for it, when I had a big battle about that with them. And I think that you should really allow committees, I mean, it's a committee parliament. Committees should be a counterbalance to government and bureau at times. So I would not be happy for, behind closed doors discussions about whether or not something came to the Justice Committee. I'd like the Justice Committee to say what they thought there might be issues arising, but it's not going to be a war zone.
Basically, your position would be that a formal referral to the Justice Committee, as opposed to the informal mechanism, which Nigel feels is what would happen in any case. So we have a little divergence of opinion there.
Can I just say, finally, convenient, subordinate legislation refer many things to the Justice Committee, and most of the time, in fact, all the time, we listen to what they have to say, and if they've raised issues with us about some of the drafting, we take it up. So there's a very healthy relationship already between subordinate legislation and the Justice Committee.
Okay, well, sorry, Nigel, final point.
Thank you, Fiona. Yes, I think you've summed it up fine. I'm just wondering, before we leave the word referral, whether we ought to perhaps just consider the prospects of something coming to us as a subordinate legislation committee with the standing orders as are currently being proposed, and us then finding, as I don't think would come as a huge surprise, that there are some policy issues which we then recognise now. I don't think there's really any possibility in the real world that there will be nothing we could describe as a policy issue. There will always be something which we could think, well, that's a justice policy or rural affairs policy or whatever the bill's about. So we're going to be in a situation where there will be lots of very small things will emerge from the evidence about which we will then have to make a decision. I don't think that's a problem. I think that's what we're being asked to do. But it then becomes possible to say, well, there will be things which we think are a bit bigger, and I don't know quite how to define that, but they're ones where we feel we would like some help from the policy committee. Now, there's nothing in the proposals at the moment that I see that gives us any kind of formal opportunity to consult, for example, the Justice Committee as we're going through stage one. And I just wonder whether that's an omission. It may be that it isn't. What we've got at the far end, if you like, is the nuclear option, which says, well, actually, we no longer think we can cope with this, and we're going to tell the Bureau as much, and we're going to hand it back. And that, I think, is in the proposals. That makes sense, but that is obviously not a desirable outcome. Now, this formal versus informal debate is the one which I think has to do with the possibility of referring to the subject committee as we're going through. Because we could either write into standing orders that we can write them a letter or write them a report outlining what we think the issues are and essentially sending it to the subject committee saying, please give us the answers to the following and then we'll work on that basis. Or we could say, well, actually, we know there's an issue here. Let's informally sort out what the Justice Committee thinks of it and we'll work on that basis. Now, I happen to think that being sensible, reasonable people, as all MSPs actually are, we could do that. I just don't have a problem with that. But I think the question that needs to be considered is whether it would be appropriate to have something within standing orders about that, just in case. Because I wouldn't want us, assuming things are pushed through the way that we're looking at them, to be in a position where we feel there's a policy issue which we know they would have a view on, which we feel their view should be the prevalent one. They will feel their view should be the dominant one, but actually we don't really have a mechanism for asking it.
Christine, do you have a comment
Well,
on
the
this?
Justice Committee is not looking for work, but what we can't have is, justice to creep happening, and it has to be a serious policy issue that comes up. I mean, I'm not unhappy if the convener of subordinate legislation writes to me as convener to my committee saying this has arisen, do you think this is a matter you want to look at? And that's okay, but if we do think there's something in this, I would want a mechanism for a referral to the Bureau, not to straight to the Justice Committee, but to the Bureau to see whether or not this is they should halt the bill process for a period while they consider whether or not this is any substance in it. So I would want a process where the Bureau, a proper process where the Bureau, and it's all very well having these, of course I'm a very pragmatic person, but if you have it too pragmatic, then when you get into something that's really difficult, you don't have any structure. So I would like a structure, as I've already outlined to you, if quite happy if the convener writes and says something's come up in this bill, we think it might be a substantial policy issue or a substantial issue that's encroaching into your area of your remit. Would you like to consider it? We can put it on an agenda, we could consider it, take a view on it. If we take a view that it is, then I think there should be a mechanism to then refer back to the Bureau and say, here's what we think. It's up to you now, boys, you know, and girls. It's up to you. This is our view on it. At the end of the day, it's always the Bureau.
I think these are two slightly different positions, if I'm picking up correctly. The re-referral, I would have thought, is for something fairly big, you know, where something has come to light after referral to the Sublege Committee, whereas I think what the convener of Sublege was saying, that there may be a stage before that where there needs to be some kind of mechanism, you know, to allow you know, a request to go from Sublege to Justice, just for a little bit of information or whatever. So am I right in thinking these are two slightly different positions?
No, I don't think so. I think I picked it up correctly. I think that what the convener would be doing is referring to the judge, say, this has arisen, you know, we want your views on this, what do you think of this? Now, in the circumstances, most of the time it will probably be, well, yeah, that's okay, yes, this has come up, but you can deal with this, you know, this is not substantial. But if something substantial was there, I don't want to just write back saying, well, we think this is substantial. What if something substantial has come up in terms of policy that's encroaching really on our remit in a, you know, a big, heavy-footed way, then there should be a mechanism for either my committee, the Subordinate Legislative Committee, either or both, to say to the Bureau, have a look at this again, halt the proceedings, have a look at this. This is a fairly substantial thing that's got. So I don't think we're saying different things, because if it was minor, the committee could just say, no, you can keep it.
Nigel?
Yeah, I don't think I'm actually disagreeing with Christine, but I do note that as I read the report, standing orders would include that, what I did previously describe as nuclear option to hand it back. That doesn't worry me, except that I don't think we want ever to get there. My concern is that we should, asking yourselves, I suspect, to reflect on whether some informal mechanism on the way might help.
We wouldn't be likely to get there if option 2 was considered, because then the committee would have had a fairly good whack at seeing whether or not there was anything that was going to arise, in fairness to subordinate legislation in the Bureau. That's why I prefer it, because, you know, early intervention, get in, see that there might be unintended ramifications from the legislation, and it's not just, you know, a scoosh.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've given that a good bit of time now. I think, Margaret McCulloch, you want to come in on another point here.
Yeah, good morning, colleagues, as well. What capacity does the Subordinate Legislation Committee have to deal with bills implementing the Law Commission's reports?
I think our very visible time capacity was probably the reason why this was ever suggested in the first place. The timetabling of subordinate legislation does, however, require us to do things on a very short fuse when we get there, which means that our business from week to week is actually also very volatile in timing. I think the record will tell you that this week I closed the formal part of the meeting 4 minutes after I opened it. That would be pretty close to the record. I think it would probably be fair to say that we don't normally go beyond an hour. Would that be a fair comment? Yes. Now, that's a pretty concentrated hour while we're doing it. As one of my colleagues commented, we do tend to look at things pretty finely. We use a pretty fine sieve, so there's some pretty concentrated work goes on, a lot of it done, of course, by our legal advisors and clerks beforehand. So there's a substantial amount of thinking time of reading the papers and working out what's going on involved, but the committee time in the committee room is often quite short, and therefore that does clearly give us capacity, purely in time, as a constituted committee, with a room already available, with a clerking team, etc. That gives us the opportunity, purely in terms of time, to do legislation or indeed anything else. What's not quite so well, let's take the other positive bit, of course, is that the members of the committee very quickly build up an expertise across many areas, because we see subordinate legislation across every area. So we'll go from the marketing of bananas to the road traffic acts and back via ports and harbours in 5 minutes. We get familiar with the workings of the legal system pretty quickly. So I think there's a considerable expertise around the room that's well capable of dealing with Scottish Law Commission reports. So I have no concerns whatever about this being our normal kind of business. I think it is very definitely our normal kind of business. When you then say, well, what about the capacity of the clerking team or legal advisors, then that's simply not so obvious. But I think my response would be on their behalf that really that is for the Parliament to deal with. If any committee needs more resource in the context of its workload, then I think that is the Chief Executive's problem rather than mine. And I think Parliament would recognise that. So I don't think we need to ask ourselves, do I have clerking or legal capacity at the moment? It's actually, if I had excess, I probably shouldn't. It should be somewhere else. But if and when a bill appears, then it's up to the parliamentary authorities to resource that, and I've no doubt that they would.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Fiona, do you want to come back
I
in?
think we've probably covered.
You think the
Yeah.
points have been covered? Okay, that's fine. Any other members got questions? Margaret, do you have another point you want to raise?
Yeah. The report actually envisages that some of these bills may be suitable to be introduced as members' bills or committee bills. Do you agree with this? Christine or Nigel?
Well, I've no whether or not it's a members or committee bill is, you know, I'm not bothered either way. I think there's an issue over, however, what support can be given to a member in charge of a bill coming forward, because, as I understand it, because it would be a law commission bill, it's not NEBU anymore, it's NGBU, non-governmental bills. I rather like NEBU, it was easier to say, but they wouldn't get support from them. So I don't know what support would be provided. So that's a practical issue involved. So I think we're probably in reality going to be looking at them either as committee bills, where I think I'm quite right saying the committee would get support, or a government bill.
Okay, thank you very much.
Nigel?
Subordinate Legislation Committee's view is that they would much prefer these bills to be introduced by the government, because that's just a standard mechanism. It's therefore properly resourced, and it would appear to be the right thing to do, quite frankly. Clearly, it can be done other ways. We certainly don't think we want a member of the committee, or our committee, to be steering a member's bill through his or her own committee. I think there was a very strong feeling that wasn't the right way to do it. Clearly, if a backbench MSP can be found to steer through a bill, that's perfectly workable, done many times, and would be facilitated. It does, however, convener, bring me to another point, which perhaps I should have, I've said for answer to the previous question, which is that the volatility of our programme and the fact that we have to do everything always within a 2 weeks time scale, I mean, that's just how subordinate legislation has to be dealt with, might mean that if we were looking at a bill, we would find that we had a very heavy workload of subordinate legislation at a point in time. It might therefore be necessary for us to work with slightly more flexible timetables than bills normally come through committees. I mention that simply because I think it might be a fact. I don't think it's a problem. I think asking for extensions from the Bureau is not difficult. It's within standing orders, and I think that would probably be granted. But I think that might be one of the consequences of what we're doing.
If I may correct the record, I've just been advised that if it was a committee bill, it wouldn't get support either, because it's a law commission would have provided the drafting of the bill and so on. So it's in the same position as a member's bill, and the law commission can't give support.
Same problems would arise there.
So it really has to be pretty well a government has to take up the bills.
Okay. Richard? Yeah.
Christine Graham mentioned earlier on that there's several legal people on our committee as members. If you read the report, I'd be very interested in your take-up on this. The report suggesting that neither the Scottish Government, the Parliament's Non-Government Bills Unit, nor the Scottish Law Commission will be able to provide support to backbench members or committees during the passage of these bills with amendments and speaking notes or legal issues arising. Do you believe that that would impact on committee scrutiny of any such bill?
Well, I think, Mr Lyle, I've just made that point. You wouldn't get the support. Previously in a committee bill, which the Justice Committee, first Justice Committee in here did, we did have support, but then it was wholly born and bred within the Justice Committee. The issue here is that the bills coming are tailor-made in a sense. They're already drafted, they're going to be laid as that. So that's why there would be no support. So I think the issue arises, unless something changes in the rules, no, it has to be a government bill.
Nigel, yes?
Yeah, thank you. Can I say that's certainly my and our perspective, that whether the government wants to introduce these bills as government bills with ministers or get a backbencher to take a bill as a kind of handout bill is of no consequence. But if it's not a government bill, it's extremely difficult to see how the resources can be provided to the member actually handling the bill.
It strikes me that that's another restraint on these bills actually getting their way through the system. You know, and we already talked earlier on about the criteria being fairly restrictive. And as I said, I would be worried that we were setting up a mechanism that just made it so difficult for anything to happen that nothing would happen. And there's no point in developing a mechanism and, to be blunt, wasting time doing that if it's not actually going to work at the end of the day. So.
I think, Kavina, that most of the work's probably already been done, actually, so I don't think we need worry too much about that. I mean, I think if we've wasted our time, we've probably wasted most of it already. I do think this will be a helpful mechanism. I think the government will see it as a helpful mechanism. There are some important reports out there. Scottish Law Commission is a venerable group of extremely skilled and experienced people who are not playing at it. They're producing bits of draft legislation which really should be on the statute book. That's why we started this process in the first place. I think the government can probably be persuaded to see that this is an important mechanism. But I do think that we are simply in a position where if these are not government-sponsored bills, they're not going to be resourced. On the other hand, we're also talking about relatively small bills. And so the resource that's required is not going to be huge. And therefore, I think probably the government ought to be able to find that resource.
The problem with some of them, though, is that at the start of it, and I remember the Long Leases Bill in the Justice Committee, everyone thought, this is pretty simple and straightforward, it'll be a doddle. It was a nightmare. It raised all sorts of questions. Now, I suppose that is when the re-referral process would come in, and would you envisage in that situation, if it suddenly turned out there was an awful lot more work involved, that there'd be the possibility of abandoning a bill, or would you ever see that happening?
That would be highly embarrassing, and I'm sure nobody would want to go there. Can I say, I don't think the Long Leases Bill, though I was on the committee where it was suggested it would be very straightforward, I don't think the Long Leases Bill would ever have met these criteria, because it involved, you know, how far back were we going to take off the 170 years, 250 years, or whatever the numbers were, forgive me, I've forgotten, was always going to be contentious. I suspect rights of way or way leaves or underground leases, or maybe they weren't leases, maybe they were licenses, were the kind of things that, again, people could see coming, and we never did resolve the law on that, actually, as I recall. I think some of those could be seen coming, so I don't think that's actually one we would ever have got.
That's why option 2 is actually such a sensible option. The other thing, if I just very shortly say, the Justice Committee had huge sympathy for the Law Commission doing all this work and, you know, bills sitting for years. We actually considered putting some of them on our agenda, even picking up one ourselves as a committee bill. We just simply didn't have the time. So in no way do we want to impede these bills becoming law. I mean, a lot of good work's done, and we're quite right, very venerable and experienced people, and so a lot of the hard work's been done. That's why I think, if I return to option 2, when you've got the Law Commission's report, the bill is laid, and the government's position, it should be pretty clear, I may come to eat my words for this, it should be pretty clear that there are going to be issues or otherwise if it were to be referred away from the Justice Committee to subordinate legislation. So I think that's an important thing to note.
Okay, thank you. Helen, I think you want to come in.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues. Are there any additional steps that you think this committee could take to help to increase the rate at which the reports laid by the Law Commission could be implemented?
Yeah, I think convener subordinate legislation has made the point is to do a pilot. Pick a bill. I would hope you would try the process that I've submitted, the option 2. Let us see how that works. There would always be we've already had informal discussions, between us. I mean, conveners are, as I say, sensible of the, been in the job a while. So we've already had them. So you would have all these, but I still feel the committee input's terribly important. So let's try one and see how it works. Subject to the things I've said about if anything came up, then I would want to have an opportunity for a referral back to the Bureau if it was substantive, after perhaps even hearing from subordinate legislators, whoops, something's come up. Or we go, something's come up, there'd be these exchanges. But then, if necessary, a referral to the Bureau. I think that's the way to find out. But I have to put this marker down, and I'm going to keep saying this. I do not want to see Justice 2 creep. Not because I'm precious, not because I'm, building a little empire for the Justice Committee, but I watched it previously. And I didn't know any other parliament on the planet that had 2 Justice Committees. And I don't want to see us, just for the sake of getting legislation through some kind of legislative sausage machine that the parliament might turn out to be, just for the sake of doing that, finding this happening. I know that's not what the Subordinate Legislation Committee wants. It's certainly not what the Justice Committee wants, but I don't want to see that even beginning to happen.
Yeah, well,
Nigel?
Thank you. I mean, I think the obvious answer to the question of what could you do is, I think, reflect on what's been said this morning, reflect on what you hear from other people, and I would ask you to get the Parliament to introduce this kind of procedure, and we'll see what we can do. As I started from the position that I think we have the ability to do a little bit more than is currently going to be done. I recognise that it's only at the margins, but that's always where you start. But I would want to reiterate also my agreement with Christine Graham. We don't want to become a Justice 2 committee or anything else to committee. Members of my committee, when we discussed this, suddenly became very protective of our apolitical nature as a committee. We routinely, if you were to look at the record, and indeed if you were to be on fly on the wall for the private discussions, we do not work in a party political way. If we can possibly avoid it, it is absolutely the exception. And people on my committee, the members in my committee, really do not want to find themselves in a position where they're doing this kind of policy stuff, finding themselves in what might be politically contentious country for a bit of a meeting and then suddenly having to put the other cap back on and do the current scrutiny, audit, if you like, of regulations and subordinate legislation. And I think people actually understand that we work in a particular way. And I think we wanted to jealously guard that, actually.
Yeah, so that emphasises the non-controversial aspect
Yes.
of the bills that would be considered. Do members have any final points, Helen? Yeah.
I think I would like to come back on that if I may, Convener, and that's just, I think Christine Graham has actually triggered a thought in my mind, and that is that, we can't actually compare other legislatures, absolutely, because every other country will have different institutions, different organisations, but has there been any research undertaken with other parliaments, say in Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, to see where, if they've had similar issues and how have they resolved these issues?
I'm not aware of any. That would that's up to your committee if you wanted to have a look at it. I'm not aware of any.
Right, thank you. That's fine. Thank
Right,
you.
okay, thank you. Well, I think that's all of the questions, points we wanted to raise with you. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming along this morning. I think that was very useful, and we teased out quite a number of points there. We'll need to go away and discuss these now and come to a decision in terms of what we recommend. So thank you very much indeed for attending. Yeah. Now that also ends the public part of the meeting, and we'll now move into private session.